Hi everyone, welcome back. So we have a real treat for you now for the final session of our Medtech track. The team at MCRA have prepared a very interactive webinar for you on the topic of evidence generation for optimal market adoption. Just remind you to please make sure you're using the chat to put your questions and comments to the team, and we'll do our best to answer them throughout the course of the discussion. But to kick things off, I'm delighted to hand you over to Tonya Dowd from MCRA for introductory remarks.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you so much for having us today. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. In addition to myself, we do have an expert panelist today, my colleague, John McDermott, our Senior Director of Reimbursement Strategy here at MCRA, Abigail Allen, our Vice President of Clinical Affairs, and Ken Stropel, who is a hospital administration expert familiar with revenue cycle management and all things related to hospital finance. And he will be representing our hospital buyer today in the session. And then we have also Dr. John Fox, who is a medical director who oversees medical technology assessments for both pharmaceuticals, medical device, and procedures. And he will be representing the payer or third-party payer constituent today in our webinar. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I'd like to just provide a quick overview of MCRA and who we are. MCRA is a full-service, DC-based CRO or clinical research organization, which considers the regulatory, reimbursement, clinical evidence, quality, and compliance requirements throughout a product's life cycle. So these synergistic service lines really work together and differentiate us because they allow our CRO to execute studies that resonate with all relevant stakeholders and which consider the commercialization pathway throughout the product lifecycle beyond even what's required for regulatory approval. Next slide. So today, we're really going to focus on understanding the evolving reimbursement pathways and the increased need for clinical and economic evidence, again, to gain that market adoption. We will have an exciting live Q&A panel session moderated by my colleague, John McDermott, and we'll be talking about the payer medical director perspective and the hospital executive perspective. And then finally, Abigail will review the execution of efficient data collection methodologies for new technologies. Next slide. So if you've ever been to a reimbursement session with us or a webinar with MCRA, we always want to ground ourselves in the three key fundamentals for reimbursement, and that is coverage, coding, and payment. And today we're really going to focus on the coverage piece, and that really is how do payers determine what is medically necessary or what is reasonable and necessary. Next slide, please. And before we get into really the coverage piece and looking at what is medically necessary, I think it's important to really just at a high level understand how hospitals and physicians are paid in the United States, typically under fee-for-service models for procedures. So if we look at the left side on the physician side, the physician submits a claim for his or her professional component to a third-party payer, either a commercial payer or Medicare or CMS. And on the hospital side, there is a separate bill submitted to a payer, again, either a commercial payer or Medicare, and that is for their facility component. So essentially, you have a bifurcated billing structure happening where the two different providers are submitting separate claims to a third-party insurer. And depending on if it's a commercial contract, that fee will be based on the commercial contract arrangement that exists between that physician or facility and the insurer. Under Medicare, there is a prospective payment system typically that actually provides a set payment based on the procedure. But I think the most important thing here really to understand is before a claim is paid, the insurer really makes a determination on whether or not that procedure, device, technology is medically necessary or is reasonable and necessary. And again, that's where coverage comes in. Next slide, please. So it's really important to understand which constituents or stakeholders your device or procedure will be subject to. So if we think about the different requirements from the various stakeholders, we know that FDA evaluates devices for safety and efficacy. So do the benefits outweigh the risks? As opposed to the payers, United Healthcare, Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, they are evaluating the device and its impact on health outcomes for a specified patient population. And that's really important to remember, the health outcomes versus the safety and efficacy. And they want to see these outcomes published in the peer-reviewed literature. And then moving to the provider, a hospital system as an example, they want to really understand the clinical benefits and how they're quantified financially. So is there adequate reimbursement for that device or technology? Does the procedure bring in an increased volume of procedures to the hospital? Is there a cost avoidance or minimal budget impact value proposition for the hospital? Does the technology enhance the reputation of the hospital? And finally, is there strong physician endorsement and demand? So it's really very important that, and again, we really encourage at MCRA from innovators to look at an end-to-end evidence generation strategy to meet all of the different stakeholder requirements beyond what's required for FDA clearance or approval. Next slide. So if we think about and we look at really the kind of key criteria that's used when commercial payers make coverage decisions, again, is the technology medically necessary? Just looking on the left-hand side, these are common criteria that exist. The first two are typically met because the technology has FDA clearance or approval. But the last three are really where it's important for manufacturers to understand that continued evidence generation plan and carry that out. So the technology must improve the net health outcomes, and it must be as beneficial to established alternatives or the current standard of care. Very important. And finally, and this is where real-world evidence comes in, the improvement of the technology must be attainable outside of an investigational setting. So really, really important to think about these as you're developing your evidence generation plan. On the right-hand side, this is Medicare's reasonable and necessary definition. So per CMS, the technology must be safe and effective, and it must not be experimental or investigational, and it must be appropriate for Medicare, the Medicare population, in other words, age 65 or over, and including the duration and frequency that is covered appropriate for the item or service. So is it furnished in accordance with accepted medical standards? Is it furnished in a setting appropriate for the patient's medical needs and condition? And is it ordered and furnished by qualified personnel? So really looking at those two different requirements, the commercial payers and Medicare contractors and CMS, it's really important as you again set about developing your evidence generation plan. Next slide. So this is the hot topic of the day, or of the year, I should say, and that is breakthrough devices. So if you're familiar with what has happened over the past several months, CMS has established and published a final rule, which is called the MCIT, Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology. MCIT is the acronym we use. And they published a program, and they're establishing a program really to fast track coverage, national coverage, for devices who have breakthrough status with the FDA. The program also seeks to codify the definition, as we just talked about, of reasonable and necessary in making coverage determinations under the Medicare program. CMS proposes to provide immediate coverage for FDA-authorized breakthrough devices for a period of 4 years. So this is really, really significant and I think a really great step in the right direction from CMS. The biggest question is what happens when coverage, this 4-year coverage ends? And really, the breakthrough device would be subject to the traditional coverage methodologies that exist under Medicare currently. They would have maybe affirmative coverage under a national coverage decision, so it would continue, or they would have non-coverage in an NCD, or it would be really MAC discretion. So Medicare administrative contractors would really determine whether or not the device would continue coverage. With the change in administration, the Biden administration has actually put a freeze for 60 days on several different rules, this one being included. However, we do expect that because the MCIT had bipartisan support, there is likely an opportunity that MCIT will proceed as expected. So the effective date, again, would be March 15th, 2021, of course, this year. Next slide. So some considerations that I think manufacturers really need to think about is, of course, the FDA, the device must be cleared or approved by the FDA, and again, given that breakthrough status. This program is voluntary, so manufacturers don't have to participate. Even if they have breakthrough status for their device, they can make the decision to choose to or not. However, manufacturers should notify per CMS of their intention to elect MCIT within 2 weeks of receiving that breakthrough designation from FDA. The most important piece of this rule, essentially, is manufacturers of breakthrough devices who participate in the MCIT will not be required or mandated by CMS to conduct clinical studies during coverage under MCIT. However, it's really, really important that manufacturers understand that coverage under MCIT is provisional. And there is essentially an inherent recommendation that manufacturers continue to generate evidence for this 4-year period to demonstrate the device's impact on health outcomes to support continued coverage and medical necessity or reasonable and necessary. So again, this is really where we're going to focus today. So I will turn it over at this point to John McDermott and to Ken Stropel and Dr. John Fox for our panel discussion. John?
Okay, thank you, Tanya. Thank you for that nice introduction. We have a fabulous panel today, and I think it's always good when we can bring together different perspectives. So as Tanya said, we have Ken representing the hospitals and the provider side, and we have Dr. Fox representing the payer side. And I think if you listen to discussion of current topics, there's often a lot of emphasis on evidence as being a key to successful commercialization, but yet it's not always clear that there's a real understanding of what evidence means to the different stakeholders. And personally, I've always found it fascinating to understand the different ways that payers use evidence compared to how providers use the very same information. So let's get started with our panel. I have an opening question for Dr. Fox. So Dr. Fox, what does a payer medical policy committee do? How in-depth do the payers look at the evidence? And what are the differences among different types of payers in their ability to scrutinize the evidence and make policy?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. So your first question was, what's the role of a medical policy? I think the primary role of a medical policy is to provide clarity for any stakeholder, whether it be the manufacturer or a facility or a provider or a patient, about how we're going to cover a new technology. The most important thing for us as a payer is to be consistent. You may not agree with our decision, but we want to be consistent. So next, what goes into development of that medical policy? So I worked for a regional health plan for a couple of decades. We had 2 people who were responsible for technology reviews. If you look at a national company, they may have dozens, and the number of technologies need to be reviewed is the same. So there are a number of technology assessment firms out there, and you know their names, that we use to help sift through all that information and trying to decide what our position was going to be. Many payers, including the one I used to work for, publish their policies, and so we want to make sure that we're not too far out ahead and not too far behind in our decisions. So we integrate all that information as well as the cost, into our decision. But as Tanya said, what we're really looking for is evidence of a net health benefit at an affordable price in our in the patients we serve. And I think probably the biggest challenge with medical devices is the durability of the data. We're paying upfront for, and typically a significant cost for a medical procedure or medical device. And when there's poor durability data, it makes it challenging for us to estimate not only what the clinical benefit is going to be, but also what the financial benefit and the cost offsets are going to be.
So one thing that I know many of our clients are often interested in is how deeply does a payer dive into the data? And, I think I've heard, anecdotally that maybe smaller regional payers have less of an ability to dive in than do the large national payers. So maybe you could comment a little bit on those two items.
I think that's probably true, although I'm sure I just offended somebody by saying that. But I think that's why we use external groups to help us assimilate all that information and distill it into manageable bites. So I think it's very accurate that we don't have the staff to be very sophisticated in our deep dives. But at the same time, when typically there's not a lot of data to review. You may have one or two clinical trials to review. And so the level of depth that we're going to is, as Tanya indicated, what is the net health benefit for this? And what are the cost offsets and the adverse consequences of this treatment?
And then one follow-up question, what is the difference between the level of scrutiny that a private payer would bring to the evidence versus what Medicare would bring to the evidence?
We just have an hour. Well, I think this MSIT decision is a fascinating one because Medicare essentially abdicated any responsibility for reviewing the data to the FDA and said if the FDA thinks it's adequate for breakthrough designation, then we'll cover it. So and clearly as a private payer, we're going to have a lot more scrutiny around these devices, especially given that they got breakthrough designation with a very modest amount of evidence. And what's intriguing is that, and Tanya alluded to this, providers are much more willing to adopt a new technology with a modest or minimal amount of evidence than payers are. And the simple reason for that is the payer or the providers are getting paid for providing this technology, and I'm having to pay for it. So I'm ultimately financially accountable. And it's interesting, having worked in an integrated delivery system where the delivery system has laid out capital expenditures to purchase a new technology and never clarified whether or not it's going to be paid for. I'm curious if Ken has had that experience where they've made investments and then discovered that, oops, not everybody's reimbursing this.
So let me actually switch over to Ken now. So Ken, from the hospital side, I guess with the equivalent process of what the payers do with their coverage committee, what does a hospital value analysis committee do? And then who reviews the evidence for presentation to that same committee?
Well, a value analysis committee, and it's called a number of things, procurement committee, whatever. It's a number of titles for it in various institutions. Really, it's a broad spectrum of players within the hospital environment. If it's a medical device, it's usually going to be brought to the committee by the physicians who would potentially be using it in the operating room or whatever area of the hospital. And they've done the screening from the FDA and the device manufacturer's perspective, and they'll present it to the group. If it's a OR procedure, operating room procedure, you're going to end up with the operating room director. You're going to end up with the pharmacy director. You're going to end up with definitely the chief financial officer of the hospital. All participants in the organization who will be impacted one way or the other by the implementation of a new device or a new pharmaceutical. they'll be involved in the decision with respect to who's going to analyze the technical data, the FDA data. We're going to leave that to what I've done in the past is we leave that to the experts. We leave that to the pharmacist if it's a pharmaceutical, but typically it's the physician who's bringing it to the committee and some of his colleagues. They're the experts. The hospital per se is not an expert in that field. With respect to the types of information we want, let's say it's a new operating room procedure. Let's say it's a new implantable device. What we're going to look at is, how's it going to impact my operating room? Is it going to extend the length of a case? Is it going to extend or shorten my length of stay, which affects my revenue side as well as my expense side? What does the device cost? Does it replace an existing device? Is it an additive expense with no reimbursement? Am I going to get paid for it or not, as Dr. Fox just said? So these are the types of data and information that we're going to need to make a decision. Are we going to provide this for the community and have the service available within the organization?
Okay, great. And Ken, I know we've talked about this in the past. I think you've also told me sometimes technologies maybe are of a small enough scope or maybe a small enough cost that they don't need to come to a value analysis committee, that they could just be handed at a department level. Could you talk a little bit about that? What technologies would go through that even lower scrutiny of review?
Well, it's really going to come down to the magnitude of the impact on the organization operationally or financially. So if it's a change out of a particular screw or rod in the orthopedic surgery department, and it's not going to cost the hospital significant amounts of money, and it's just going to be a change in device, it's not going to be an issue. If the new pharmaceutical product is out on the market and it's going to be requested by the intensive care physicians, and it's going to cost the hospital, substantial sums of money, $10,000 a regimen, that's going to require some more scrutiny. Is the outcome going to be such that it benefits the patient to the extent that the hospital should really consider purchasing that new device or pharmaceutical? One of the problems we run into is much, if not most, of the revenue that the hospital receives is based on some type of fixed reimbursement, whether it's a per diem for each day the patient's in the hospital, or a case rate, as in the case of Medicare. It's a fixed reimbursement. And so when I start increasing my expense to the extent that I'm no longer being compensated for the cost of the increase, it's problematical for the hospital. You got to survive financially in order to provide the service, and that's the dilemma that occurs.
Okay, then one last follow-up on this. So it appears that hospitals are looking, they have slightly different reasons for looking at the data than the payer does, and therefore that they're not digging as deeply, perhaps into the nuances of the clinical trial or the statistical significance, that it may be a more holistic look at the technology and what it means for the overall hospital business. Would you say that that is a fair way of describing it?
Yes, absolutely. It really, we're not in a position as a hospital to do the down and dirty analysis of the FDA studies, or even the studies that come out of any other peer review type information. The reality of the hospital is it going to benefit the patient? Number one. Is it going to benefit or hurt the hospital financially? Is it going to help drive a larger market share? Is it going to shorten the length of stay? Those are the types of data that the hospital needs to analyze. The physician's already done that analysis. He's his perspective is going to be it's better for my patient.
Okay, great. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So this is about the relative importance of clinical versus economic data. And I will say, I talk to an awful lot of device companies, and the most common question I get is, do I need to do a pharmacoeconomic study? I was just asked that again yesterday. And so I guess an observation here, I don't think everybody has a common definition of what a pharmacoeconomic study is. And so we can go back to Dr. Fox now. So the question is, what is meaningful for payers in the economic realm?
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, now we can.
Yeah, sorry. I think you can ask one payer, and every payer will give you a different response. But I think what I'm interested in is what's the expected utilization of this technology? Will it be cost additive? Will it be replacement, as Ken talked about? There are some technologies that I don't really care about because they're paid in an inpatient DRG. So once we've decided that we're going to pay for a TAVR procedure, I don't care which device you use. But in the outpatient setting, where I'm more commonly paying on an APC or a reduced fee for service or off a fee schedule, I'm very concerned about what that budgetary impact is going to be, and then what the long-term cost offsets are going to be. And I would say those cost offsets have to be materialized within 12 to 18 months for them to be counted in the net cost. But again, I think it depends on what the intent is. If this is a device that's simply symptom relieving or palliative, that's different than something that's disease modifying or restorative or even curative.
And I know we've also talked about this many times before, but when you do your review of the evidence supporting, the case for a new device, I believe you've often told me that the primary thing that you're looking at is the strength of the clinical evidence, and that the economic is a secondary consideration. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's generally true. I mean, if there's something that provides a meaningful clinical benefit and has a durable benefit, especially in the device space, that is going to be primary. It's going to be, it would be unethical for us to deny access to something that had a meaningful benefit. But I think that's the key question. Is this a meaningful benefit? So if you're looking at patient-reported outcomes as your primary outcome measure, we're always looking at an MCID, or a minimal clinically important difference. So you could report that something's statistically significant, but what I really want to know is this a clinically meaningful benefit? And that's a shortcoming in many studies, is that they produce, we don't have that information and I have to go look it up, or it's a very nominal difference. And so it's not really differentiating from any other alternative that exists.
Does the economic data play a role in determining prior authorization or step therapy, after you've determined that it is a meaningful benefit?
Well, here's my chance for my football analogy. So if in our analysis, we think that this is going to reduce the total cost of care, I'm going to get out there and play offense and promote the use of this technology. And precision medicine, I know we're not talking about precision medicine, but that's an example where there are many opportunities for reducing the total cost of care. If, on the other hand, this is going to add to the total cost of care, I'm going to play defense. I'm going to cover it still. I'm still going to play the game, but I'm going to try and limit access to that technology to those patients populations where it's been shown to have the most benefit. I should also add that since we're talking about the economic analysis, that the source of that economic analysis is important. I've never seen a pharmacoeconomic analysis or a budget impact model from the manufacturer that didn't support wholeheartedly the device or drug or technology that was being touted. So my preference is to have something done independently. And there are a number of academic institutions around the country, and I'm sure some private companies that do that too. But in any economic analyses, there are a number of different assumptions that have to be made that can introduce bias. And the fact that I've never seen an analysis that didn't support the device just makes me prefer something independently done, hands down.
Okay, great. And Ken, over to you now. So I guess the same question, is a pharmacoeconomic or economic assessment of some kind helpful to the hospital? And what should that look like from your perspective?
Well, the economic analysis for the hospital is going to be, as I alluded to earlier, is this going to replace an existing technology or an existing device? If it does, what's the additional cost? I've never ever had the opportunity to purchase an additional or a new device that didn't cost more than the old one. Does it substantially improve patient care? And the reality of it is, as I mentioned earlier, my reimbursement is effectively fixed. And when that situation occurs, he who pays the bills does the most research and puts the guardrails on whatever the device is. We all know that in the pharmaceutical world, the latest and the greatest drug that comes out, whatever it is, it's new, everybody wants to use it. The data presented by the manufacturer is always positive, or it wouldn't be there. And the reality of it is it that much better? Does it do the same thing? Sure. But the whole idea of the analysis of the hospital is, how can I do this economically and cover my costs? And much of the situation exists. It comes out there, everybody wants to use it, but nobody's going to pay for it because, as Dr. Fox was saying earlier, it just adds to a surgical procedure, or it extends the operating room time, which is an expense to the hospital, or it requires additional staffing for what benefit to the patient. That's the kind of the decision tree that we use.
So Ken, I know we've talked about fixed payment and some of the incentives that creates for a hospital. When you have that payment methodology and you have a new device that is going to add additional expense, I know that you've told me there is another consideration for the hospital, and that is the, I guess, reputation in the community, the ability to market yourself to local surgeons to gain market share for OR time and things like that. So is it possible to bring a cost additive technology to market under fixed payment and have it warmly embraced by hospitals?
Sure. And the major question is going to be in that case, what is my competitor down the street doing? If he's buying the latest and the greatest surgical device that my surgeons they really want to use it and they want to bring their patients to my hospital, but I'm not going to spend the money for the device. So they're going to take the patients to the hospital that's got the device. So it's a market competition issue. It's can I expand my market available to the hospital? There's a number of those types of questions that get asked. The other thing is, what is the incremental increase in cost? And which like I said, we always assume it's going to cost more, but what's the frequency of its use? What's the utilization? If it's going to cost me another, sum of money to do 9 cases a year, I'm not sure that's going to be a relevant issue for me to waste a lot of time on. If I'm going to do, 200 total hips, and a total hip implant is another $10,000 a device, we're going to have second thoughts about the whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
A great example of that, I think, was robotics. Robotics allowed a lot more surgeons to do complicated surgery, for example, prostatectomies, nerve-sparing prostatectomies. And our position as a payer was, there's adequate evidence to support that in some cases this produces a better outcome, but those are sparingly few where there is evidence to support a better patient outcome. Prostate cancer is no difference in long-term outcomes in patients. And for the most part, we simply said, we're paying for an outcome. We're paying for prostate removal for surgery. How you do it, we don't care. Another example is in hysterectomies. We said, if you want to use a robot, that's fine, but we're going to pay you the same amount. And then I think that really left it to the facility and physicians to decide what's the most appropriate use for this. And just the other kind of nuance to this, while robotics suggested that the manufacturer suggested this would improve return to work and return productivity, surgeons didn't necessarily reduce the amount of time that they gave patients off because they had a minimally invasive procedure. So even some of the employer benefits of robotics weren't realized.
And if I can comment on that, I happen to be involved with the development of a program around the robot. And one of the real issues was it extended the operating room time substantially, which is a detriment for the physician's efficiency. And certainly it was costing the hospital more money. There's a whole number of consumable costs that were, I don't know, $5,000, $6,000 a case added to the cost of the procedure. And at the same time, I've got to have a whole new set of operating room people who are trained on the equipment, and I got to have the equipment available 5, 6, 7 days a week. So I've got 2 crews, 2 new sets of staff to deal with. So that's a significant decision.
Good. Hey, let me go back to one thing on the economic data. So Dr. Fox gave us his opinion of company provided models and things like that. Ken, when you, from the hospital perspective, when you receive or see those prepared by companies, are those credible to you as well, or did they serve did they serve any helpful benefit for the manufacturer?
They're interesting, but I'm going to trust it, and then I'm going to verify it. So I'm going to do my own side-by-side analysis with the data, not the conclusions, but the data, and do my analysis to look at it from the hospital's perspective, because typically the ones that I've seen of any substance, it's clearly a benefit for the manufacturer, and it's going to look fairly rosy, but I want to know the downside of that before I make a decision.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. And then Dr. Fox, just one follow-up on that for you. Is it, I know you're highly skeptical of them. Is it ever the case that when you see a model, even though you don't trust the numbers that are in it, that it might actually raise a question in your mind, or might convince you to go take a closer look on your own, so that in the end, even though it wasn't accepted at face value, it still might have served a purpose for the manufacturer?
Oh, yeah, sure. I don't mean to suggest we ignore them completely, but Ken probably said this, trust but verify. But I would say it's very difficult for us to verify these models simply because we don't have as much data or the staff to do so. But you asked a question earlier about, is it clinical or economic? I think, TAVR might be another good example where the 1-year survival data at patients who are at high risk of mortality was so much better that we just had to, we covered it, and we ate the cost. We increased premiums in order to be able to afford that. And then with lower risk patients, when evidence showed that outcomes were better and complication rates and rehospitalization rates were lower, we covered it there too. So I don't want to paint the picture that this is all about the cost, and there was a separate DRG, I think, established for that. And so we accommodated the adoption of the advent and the adoption of new technology.
Okay. All right, so let's move on. I've got another line of questioning here. So this is on the level and the sufficiency of the evidence. And I'm going to start with Dr. Fox. And I have an anecdote. I have a client. They were very proud. They had a single randomized control study with 3-year follow-up data. And they very proud. They invested a lot of money, gold standard. They took it to a payer. And the payer's response was, "Oh, that's wonderful. I need 5 years," or "That's wonderful. I need 2," something like that. So the question to you is, how much evidence is enough and I guess of what quality evidence is going to be sufficient to win coverage.
Yeah, it reminds me when people ask me that question, I'd say, "Well, how much data do you have?" And they give me a number, and I said, "Oh, I need one more day." And I don't think there's a right answer, but I think as a general rule of thumb, we're the most important thing to us is the durability of the response. And if you're cured from cancer at 1 year, it's likely that you the question is how durable a benefit of that is that, or if in a surgical procedure, probably a good example of that was when the artificial intervertebral disc came out for lumbar disc replacement as opposed to fusions. They came out with 2-year data and suggested that the results were comparable and that there was less likelihood of adjacent disc disease or adjacent disc degeneration. And I think people said for the investment, for the cost of that procedure, we need more durable data. So I know I'm not really answering the question, but suffice it to say that the higher the investment, the more durable the longer term data that we need to see. And although this is kind of an analogous situation, if you look at CAR T therapy for cancer, we're making a significant upfront investment, and we want information to suggest that this response rate is going to be durable before we make a significant investment like that.
Now, is there a minimum standard for the quality of evidence? So a lot of the companies that we work with have 510K or approvals that are lower than a PMA. And there is some frustration on their part that maybe they fully don't understand the payer process for evaluating devices like that. But what could you tell them about maybe the minimum level of evidence that a payer really needs in order to feel comfortable providing coverage?
Fair. What I'm really looking at is compared to the standard of care that exists today, what is the net health benefit of this, and what's the durability of that benefit, and then what's the incremental cost? So if you have data that doesn't have a comparator arm, that makes it very difficult for us to infer what the net health benefit is. So I would say that the strongest evidence is an RCT compared to an existing standard of care. That may be difficult to get approval through an IRB, but that would be the gold standard, because now I have a clear comparison that allows me to calculate what the health benefit is and what the incremental cost is. In those circumstances where you don't have a comparison group, it's really the magnitude of the benefit compared to historical controls or historical evidence that's relevant. And the smaller that delta, the less credible it is. I mean, if you can show that, and drugs is probably the best example of this, where you approve a drug based on a phase 2 non-randomized single-arm trial, but you double the response rate and double the overall response rate compared to the prior treatment. That's a double, triple. But in devices, much less evident. If this is just another energy delivery technology for atrial fibrillation or AFib ablation, I don't really care. In that setting, it's an inpatient, or it's an outpatient, it's an outpatient procedure. I'm going to pay it off the CPT-4 code and not off the device itself. I'm kind of device agnostic. I've already decided I'm going to pay for AFib ablations, and so I'm less concerned about the device.
Okay, good. And let me turn that back over to Ken then. So Ken, and here I think we may start to see some maybe sharper differences or distinctions between our two stakeholders today. So Ken, in terms of the minimum level of evidence, I'm guessing that the hospital has different, they're not necessarily worse, but just lower requirements, because you don't actually need to give it maybe the level of scrutiny. But could you comment on what kinds of evidence the hospital will typically accept?
Well, the hospital's not, in my experience, the hospital's not going to get into the analytics of the details, the weeds, the analytics of the clinical benefit. If that's what my medical staff is going to be really the experts in. So to go to one of the pharmaceutical issues, a number of years ago, there was a drug that came out to treat sepsis, terrible disease. Well, the drug came out, it was a ridiculously expensive drug. It had only a 10% efficacy rate, and you didn't know who was going to benefit and who wouldn't. Well, ultimately, we chose not to use that drug, although the FDA was, they ultimately refused to approve it. But that would be a great example of one that we would stand back and go, well, okay, it's got a 10% efficacy rate. We don't know who's going to benefit from it, but it's going to cost us millions of dollars a year because every patient who's got a temperature is going to get it. And that's an example of a gross example of that decision tree. Now, with respect to a device, if it's a total hip device, is it going, as Dr. Fox referenced, is it going to actually be more durable and extend the useful period of time, another 10 years? Okay, if it's going to do that, maybe it's worth paying a little more for the device. But then that's where my evaluation comes into play. What is it actually going to cost me during the year? What is the utilization going to be? There's not a cut and dry decision point. It's what is the impact on the organization or my ability to provide other devices and benefits for the medical staff to take care of their patients with. So it's a give and a take, and the more you get the medical staff involved, the better your decisions are going to be. That's a long way of saying it's a tough question to answer.
Okay, and I think we're just about at the end of our time. Let me have maybe just one kind of summary question here for each of you. So Dr. Fox, if you could give any guidance or advice to our medical device listeners or viewers out there today on what is the essence of what the payers are looking for in evidence, just in a sentence or two or three. Oh, we can't hear you.
I think we're looking for an alternative treatment option that provides a superior outcome to the existing standard of care that can be produced affordably with a durable benefit. Don't want to have to pay for redos after 18 months. and I don't want to have additive therapy that's on top of existing therapy already. So again, if I can find a way of improving outcomes at a lower cost, I'm going to drive that. I'm going to push that amongst providers and facilities. That would be the gold ring to reach for.
Perfect. And Ken, what about on your side?
Well, I agree with Dr. Fox's perspective, but I think there's an additional perspective within the hospital. Dr. Fox's reference is basically to a particular procedure. I have to look at the whole organization and the politics of the medical staff and where they can take their patients elsewhere. So I want the best product. I want it to either reduce my costs through a length of stay change or a number of ways, or not increase my cost and find some way to get reimbursed for it.
Perfect. Thank you. So I thought this was a really good discussion where we tried to highlight some of the differences in the stakeholders, and thanks to both of you. Now let me turn it back over to Tanya, and then we have a few things left for our webinar today.
John, thank you so much. And Dr. Fox, thank you. Ken, thank you so much. We're going to turn it over to Abigail Allen now, our Vice President of Clinical Affairs at MCRA, who is going to provide an overview of evidence development and MCRA's capabilities in that area. So Abigail?
Tanya, and thank you everyone for that amazing discussion. So we're almost out of time, so I'll be pretty quick here. But we thought it would be helpful to talk about the data now. You know, you've decided you want to collect data, and you know, how do you do it? How do you go about doing it? You know, Dr. Fox talks about a randomized trial. You know, that's certainly you know, one kind of larger option. So we really narrowed down the studies to really make it clear on how to collect the data and the different types of studies. So just for all clinical research, as everyone knows, you do have to get IRB approval. And sometimes the IRB approval is saying, you know, we are waiving consent. You know, it's in these retrospective studies, you can waive consent and make it easier, but you have to have the IRB state that for you. So all of the studies I'm going to quickly go through, you do have to apply to IRB. So, you know, you can do a post-market clinical study, and this is just to further generate, continue to collect that data. You know, Tanya talked about at the beginning, even just continuing to collect the data just to support what you've already said and what you've already proven. And then you can do, you know, a real world registry study. This is really just at the sites that are currently using your product. You go to them and you say, we just want to collect everything for all of the patients that you are currently using this product for. So then it's just kind of, it's almost like a data dump, and you put the data in and then you can look at it later. And then you can do retrospective studies. You can do retrospective studies a lot like the registry study we talked about a moment ago, where again, it's more of a data dump. You look at all the data that's happened at that site, or you can specifically collect data through remote access, EMR, or just through the site's charts to review the data to collect the specific data for your study. So those are kind of the different types of studies you can run. And then obviously, and of course, physicians can always review reported outcomes for your product and provide really collect the data and really share how the device and procedure are influencing efficacy, ease of use, quality of life, and such that type of data. And then we just thought it'd be helpful to show just at MICRA as an example of how we would run the study and how we would incorporate the different teams. If you could, thank you. So, you know, just as an example of how you would run the study at MICRA, at our CRO, or wherever else you were running the study, all of these teams would work together with your life sciences panel. You know, this is the expectation, is that you all come together from the regulatory team, the reimbursement team, the clinical team, work together to support what the advisory panel is suggesting that you do for your study. And this is just an example of how at MICRA we would run the study for you to support those continued data generation and claims that you've made to support that throughout the duration of the product life cycle. So, and with that, I will pass it back to, I know there's been some questions coming in, so pass it back to my colleagues to answer any additional questions you have.
Thank you, Abigail. So I know we don't have a ton of time for questions here, but I at least wanted to get through a few. And then if there are questions that anybody still has that we can't get to, I encourage you to reach out to us. You can email us at info@micra.com. It's info@mcra.com. And let us know your question, and we will be sure to follow up with you and can schedule a call as needed. So looking at the questions here for the team, we have one that says, when a company receives an NTAP from CMS, do private payers typically also provide added reimbursement?
Well, I'll take that. I guess that's for me. Yes, typically, I mean, certainly for our Medicare Advantage patients, we do. And for commercial patients, we evaluate that on the new technology add-on payment as a separately, but typically we'll follow Medicare's reimbursement methodology.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see, another one here is, are there differences in how payers, regulators, and clinicians define meaningful clinical benefit, and how device companies navigate that? Go ahead, Dr. Fox, if you.
I can't speak on behalf of regulators, but I think, yes, there is a difference. So I'm a physician. Most things I don't live and breathe, and I'm not a practicing physician anymore. So I'm just looking for an externally validated endpoint about what's considered a clinically meaningful difference. And if there's nothing published that's an independent estimation of what that minimally clinically important difference is, I'm really stuck. And then I have to go ask a provider, and they're going to say, well, yeah. But I think that's the challenge that we have, as we're speaking two different languages. Any benefit may be meaningful to a provider, but I'm looking, if I'm going to have a substantial increase in cost, I'm looking for an independent validation that that benefit is a meaningful one.
I think just to add to that, Alyssa, and thank you, Dr. Fox, is again, remembering that the regulatory approval or clearance, the data that's required for that is not necessarily adequate, or isn't adequate, if you will, for the payer and or the hospital system. So, with FDA clearance, there's really no data required. Bench testing data is adequate, but even with a PMA, definitely not adequate enough to, again, meet the payer standards. I think that's a really important piece to understand.
I think what's interesting and where these two kind of converge is when the delivery system or the hospital and its provider groups take on financial risk, either through a Medicare ACO where they've got two-sided risk, or with commercial contracts where they have two-sided risks. I think most of those delivery systems are really focused on primary care and managing chronic diseases, but the more sophisticated ACOs are asking these very same questions. Is adding this technology above and beyond what Ken talked about, which I appreciate, is this worth taking money out of our pockets? Because at the end of the day, I've got a fixed pool of money, and is this benefit a meaningful enough one that I should be paying out of my pocket for this technology, for this innovation?
Yeah.
Great. Another question that came in, with MCIT, will private payers be required to cover the device for MAPs as they would with an NCD?
Oh yeah, for MA plans, yes. At least that's my understanding today. That would apply to MAPD plans.
So for Medicare Advantage plans, the answer is yes, Dr. Fox, but what is your thought on the commercial side for the commercial members? Do you foresee commercial payers adopting those?
No, I don't.
Adopting MCIT?
I don't. I think we have a tremendous frustration with breakthrough designations because that suggests it's promising but unproven, and I think it's probably the slight nuance there is if this has a strong potential for reducing the total cost of care, there may be some earlier adopters. But if this is clearly going to add to the total cost of care and has unproven benefit, we'll use that language, experimental, your three favorite words, experimental, investigational, or unproven. So I don't think that this designation does manufacturers any favors in the commercial payer space.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so it looks like that's all of the, maybe we have time for one more. So, and I don't know, this might be too much of an answer in the little time left. We can take it offline if so, but with no or very early robust prospective health economic data for informing payment rates, how will payment during the temporary MCIT period be determined?
I guess I can take that. So MCIT really is only for coverage. So MCIT actually has nothing to do with payment. So nothing would be different if you didn't have a code and you had MCIT, you would still not have a code and you would need to use unlisted codes. You'd be subject to the normal timelines. You still have to apply for NTAP on the normal timeline. So really MCIT only provides you coverage. It does nothing to get you down the path of coding or payment. And that's not a very welcomed answer, but that's what MCIT is. It takes care of one of the three, coverage only.
Great, thank you. Okay, Ali, we'll hand it back to Angela from LSX now to close it out as we are out of time. But again, I encourage you to submit any other questions through our website or email info@micra.com, and we will absolutely address them and schedule time as needed. Thank you, everyone.
And I'll echo that. Thank you so much to the team at MICRA for an excellent closing session. What a high to finish this event on. So that's it for our MedTech track. I would like to thank all of our speakers and sponsors for their contributions over the past week. And of course, thank you to all of you in our audience who have been so proactive with asking questions and getting involved. Now, it might be the end of the MedTech content, but it's not over yet. The partnering system is still open until the 12th of February. So you have another full week to message people and set up meetings, and of course, follow up with your questions. If you'd like a little bit more detail from today's session, I urge you to follow up with the MICRA team. All of the content we've shown over the last few days has also been recorded and will be available for you to review up until the 12th as well. So other than that, thank you once again for your attention this week. It's been a real pleasure hosting you here on the MedTech stage, and hopefully this time next year we'll all be meeting in person in London with a drink in our hands. But until then, thank you everyone and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right, and the stream has stopped.
All right.